Labas rytas, good morning, dobar ranek. Um, Welcome to the 7th Leonidas Donskis Memorial Conference. I hope you will enjoy the program of today. As first speaker for the opening session, I would like to ask Asta Skaisgiryte to come. She is the chief advisor to the president of Lithuania, Gintautas Nausėda. Asta.
Dear Chairman, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, this conference takes place in a context of war in Europe. War that is going on for 2.5 years. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the global order based on international law is being so openly and so viciously attacked. Of course, I'm speaking about Russian military aggression against Ukraine, which is yet another shameful example of Moscow's unwillingness to follow the basic rules of international order and coexistence. With its vast experience in leading punitive expeditions and producing frozen conflicts, Russia has started a major war, as we see, of imperial conquest and territorial expansion. It proceeds under genocidal slogans and with numerous well-documented crimes against humanity. But the real question is why? And I understand that this conference will also try to find the answers to this question. Why? Why the conflict? Why the military attacks? Why the genocide? Why? Why is Russia behaving in such an aggressive way, out of step with the general attitudes of European nations and European civilization? Why does an unprovoked war against a neighboring country enjoy popular support inside Russia? Answers to these questions should help us to resist Russia's ongoing war against the democratic world. They should keep us avoid new mistakes. The answers, I believe, lie in the history of both Russian and European. One crucial lesson, sadly, was not fully comprehended either during the last World War or afterwards. The international community chose to forget that the Nazi regime did not act alone in Europe. It was also the Soviet Union that attacked, occupied, and illegally annexed neighboring countries. It was also those champions of communist ideology who actively sought to destroy the world order. And they partially succeeded. We are all living in a world that was created on the ashes of the Second World War. Yet the same disastrous conflict is still being waged, if not in reality, then in the minds of some men. It is still being fought out as part of Russia's hybrid war against the democratic West. It is being fought out both within collective memories and wherever national identities interact with each other. The Second World War is still highly relevant today, for its ending means completely different things to different people and to different nations as well. For the countries of Western Europe, the war ended in 1945. What followed was a great era of democracy, reconstruction, and rapid economic growth. The Nazi regime was condemned at Nuremberg. Old wounds healed, historic adversaries reconciled. It looked different to those stuck under the occupation of the Soviet forces. Many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were subjugated, people further terrorized by the Soviet totalitarian regime, social life and economy destroyed on the altars of communist ideology. In Lithuania, where more than 200,000 people were murdered earlier by Nazis and their collaborators, Soviet rule meant further staggering losses. In the first decade of Soviet rule, 20,000 members of the anti-Soviet resistance were killed. Additionally, during the whole period of Soviet occupation, 25,000 political prisoners died in special camps and prisons. 28,000 people, many of them children and elderly, died in Siberian exile. Out of 280,000 deported or imprisoned in the Gulag, more than a third have never returned. Almost 500,000 people, 1/6 of the pre-war population, were forced to flee to the West. It is no wonder that for us Lithuanians, the Second World War ended only in 1993, when the last tanks of the occupying Russian force left our country. Regrettably for Russia, the war seems not to have ended at all. 79 years after the fall of Berlin Wall, the Russian regime still widely uses the same old imagery of war against the so-called fascists. This is by no means accidental. Longing for the Soviet past and the artificial mythology of the Great Patriotic War remain at the core of the official ideology of Russian state. In Russia, the Allied victory against Nazism is for most a national triumph, achieved through great pain and supposedly with little outside help. Even the worst crimes of the Stalinist dictatorship, such as the Ukrainian Holodomor or mass deportations of entire ethnic groups, are being justified as bringing the final victory closer. Declaring that the great end justifies even the most brutal means, the current Russian regime also absolves itself of accountability. It is truly unfortunate that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has not gone through any real desovietization or spiritual renewal. The one country that suffered for the longest time, the one who lost enormous intellectual, cultural, and economic potential to brutal social experiments, continues to glorify Soviet mass murderers, war criminals, and architects of genocidal campaigns. Lessons not learned move Russia along the same old path of imperial expansion. While doing so, it is also actively trying to misuse the memory of the Second World War and create a new political reality. Drawing lessons from Stalin, Vladimir Putin rewrites history to his own liking, both to gain more personal power and to project Russia's national power abroad. What we have been seeing recently is the persistent assault on the efforts to establish the truth about the crimes of the Soviet totalitarian regime. And this is where we must resist at all costs. Ladies and gentlemen, the day has come for Europe to finally acknowledge the crimes associated with both major totalitarian ideologies, Nazism and communism. The world has already decisively condemned the Nazi regime. The bitter lessons of Nazi crimes have become an obligatory part of the educational process all over Europe. We know a lot about the victims and the perpetrators. And yet it is unfortunate that the memory and knowledge of Soviet crimes has yet to find their rightful place within the general European consciousness. Russian military aggression in Ukraine, followed and supported by a disinformation campaign, is an important wake-up call. To control the great tide of lies aimed against the democratic community, our societies need to know more about the totalitarian past. We need to seek the truth. For this, historical research and education programs must be expanded all over Europe and beyond. Precise evaluation and understanding of the communist past must pervade all our political discussions. My great wish is that the Prague-based European platform of memory and conscience continues to grow and make a serious impact by laying bare many crimes of totalitarianism. This crucially important network of public and private institutions and organizations active in research, awareness raising, and education must have all the necessary tools to succeed. I may remind you that back in 2022, the leaders of Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Romania, President Noseda among them, sent a letter to European institutions to join efforts in strengthening the European platform of memory and conscience and providing the platform with adequate political and financial support. Our hope is that the new initiatives and concentrated efforts will be guided by the existing European Parliament resolutions on European conscience and totalitarianism. Let us join our efforts in building a memorial for all victims of totalitarian regimes in Brussels. Brussels because it is the capital of Europe. Let us finally break down that iron curtain of ignorance, disinformation, and political manipulation. Every European nation needs this, for the truth and only the truth shall make us free. Thank you very much for listening and have meaningful and constructive discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Asta. I would now like to give the floor to Marius Vascega, head of the European Commission representation in Vilnius, Lithuania. Marius.
Tikiuosi girdite mane.
I will be speaking Lithuanian. Dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Robert van der Noordia for the opportunity to open the 7th International Conference in memory of Leonidas Donskis. Leonidas Donskis was a unique thinker and public figure. His television program, Without Anger, was a title and a method, a way of talking, hearing, and seeking the truth without division. Leonidas Donskis' approach to discourse was based on curiosity, empathy, and intellectual honesty, the qualities that have become rare in the contemporary public sphere. This approach is the antithesis of what we see today. While contemporary actors such as Putin deliberately divide societies and create conflicts, Leonidas Donskis tried to maintain unity and promote constructive dialogues. I remember some 15 years ago, we Lithuanians used to gather in Brussels at one of our fellow colleagues' place and listen to Leonidas, who was the member of parliament, singing the Beatles songs. We felt more united than ever, and we were happy about Europe and its success. Europe was and still is building a system based on 3 pillars: democracy and human rights, a market economy, and strong social policies, all equally important. And we have been followed, or at least tried to be followed, by many countries worldwide. However, 15 years on, the world is a different place now. I want to draw your attention to one document which is not discussed in Lithuania, even though its significance is global. On the 4th of February 2022, just 20 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin and Xi Jinping met in China and signed the Declaration of No Limits Partnership. It speaks of a world with a growing redistribution of power and a move toward a new multipolar world order. However, the coded purpose of this declaration is quite other. It's an excuse to subvert the international order and to legitimize aggressive policies under the pretext of the alleged needs of the international community. The concepts of human rights and freedoms in the democracy in that declaration are up to each state and its choices, thus erasing the universal content of human rights and democratic standards and leaving them with a name that any tyrant could fill in with whatever meaning suits him. There is no mention of media freedoms, although it would be interesting to read how the government's propaganda channels are to be protected and nurtured. Thus, the Western system in which human rights and freedoms are the basis of democracy is not at all aspirational in this part of the world or that declaration. It is supposedly all about good life for the people, or a sausage instead of freedom. To some, this may seem attractive to some people, but when you are not free, the sausage sides will also depend on the government, not on you. And when you realize this and wonder about it, you no longer have either freedom or sausage. How do we convince people that black is actually white and the white is actually black? Putin's Russia, through disinformation, is creating alternative realities. The famous troll factories and propaganda channels such as RT or Sputnik are the modern weapons for breaking down and creating doubts, turning lies into truth and the truth into lies. Disinformation can come in many different levels. There may be some that are easy to spot because it is something entirely made up, and some may look at first sight as genuine, so-called deepfake, images created by artificial intelligence. The best example and the most and the worst at the same time, I can think of another example which I can think of in my personal life when 1 or 2 years ago, even in Lithuania, some people believed that European Commission suggested to increase the retirement age. And I would not be surprised if some of these disinformation comes back before the elections. The fake news offer simple recipes and an easy-to-understand world, which is black and white. It is easy to succumb to this temptation. After all, it is easier to see contrast. But democracy is not just about black and white. Leonidas Donskis understood the subtleties of democracy. In one of his last commentaries entitled The Unloved European Union, he quoted Adam Michnik, who said, "Democracy is gray. It is based on constant compromises, negotiations, and political prose. Democracy is an infinite shades of gray because its strength lies in diversity of opinion." Leonidas Donskis also added that democracy does not work on its own without critical thought, real journalism, pluralism. It turns into formal procedures that dictatorships or authoritarian regimes can also carry out. And for democracy, every opinion, every shade is important. Disinformation peddlers are trying to distort this and change our understanding of diversity to prove that instead of a broad palette, there are only two alternatives. Today, as perhaps in the past, gray also means boring. Our intellectual honesty is also gray. Is there a room for other shades of gray when black and white are much easier to understand? Is there any room for Leonid Donskis and his followers in the current geopolitical situation? Today, when we are discussing our values and necessities in Europe, we must remember that our strength lies in our ability to compromise. Europe was born from painful historical lessons, war and division. The European Union has its roots in the painful lessons of 2 world wars. in the realization of that gray truth, that we are strong being together. That gray compromise means everyone wins, which is win-win situation, or not a zero-sum game. Intellectual honesty and curiosity motivate us to look for new shades in current or past processes. They enrich our knowledge of the world, our world, our perception. In this conference, I look forward to your insights into what black and white is and how to recognize the shades of gray between them and how to make gray not dull. This is equally important. I wish you a meaningful discussion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a week ago, our Andrei Sakharov Research Center presented the Lithuanian version of the Dissident Tour, a project developed by a project manager, Neringa Garisanskite. The Dissident Tour is not only unique, Vilnius is probably the first city to have a tour that shows things that happened during the dissident times to locals and foreigners alike, but it's also highly necessary. New generations have grown up in Lithuania for whom the Soviet past is already history. I know, probably all of them have grandparents who suffered during Soviet occupation, either because of deportation or because of administrative punishment and what Andropov used to call prophylactizирование, preventive measures, which usually meant scaring the shit out of someone so he or she would never think of any anti-Soviet actions again. But it's already different. They are already not having this Soviet fear. They have become truly free persons, free from the psychological consequences of Soviet terror. That is, I want to stress, a blessing. But still, it's important that they should know the past, because losing freedom is a lot easier than gaining it. This is something that those who oppose the Soviet regime, who suffered at their hands, who lost their lives in the process, know full well. It's something our Ukrainian friends also know full well. Their country is currently the main focus of Putin's KGB regime, in which human life has no value and human beings are all dispensable little cogs in an Orwellian machinery. In Ukraine, life has become pretty much black and white. Black being Russian occupation and terror, white being defending and maintaining Ukrainian independence and the reinstatement of full sovereignty over its territory. Black and white and shades of gray, those are the concepts we are discussing today. The black and white that simplifies things, both for the oppressor and the oppressed. Shades of gray that introduces that reality is multidimensional and it's based on our current morals and terribly complex, What we see today, what we believe today is based on our current morals and values and our current understanding of reality. And with time, that understanding changes and we realize that there are multiple layers that we never saw. Dr. Ion Vianou, the first chairman of the board of the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry, one of the NGOs I work for, tried many years ago to make me understand this. He was Romanian and he fled the Ceausescu regime in 1977 when he, as one of the first, claimed that psychiatry was used for political purposes in his country. Romania was a country dominated by the secret police Securitate, maybe even more than the DDR by the Stasi. And he always told me, when you think you understand, realize that you understand only one layer. There are at least 2 or 3 more. Ion Vianou passed away this June, and so did Peter Redaway, whose 9,000 books library and huge archive are now in the possession of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center. Peter died in late July, and the fact that all major newspapers in Britain and the United States carried an obituary shows the importance of the man. He helped literally hundreds of students on the road to a future career, and I was one of the fortunate ones. But most importantly, he installed in them the notion that as an academic, you have the duty to be also a beacon of morality. You cannot pretend that being an academic is a carte blanche, not to be involved, not to be engaged. We all have a role to play in defending freedom and preventing such horrors as the Nazis and the Putin regime. In his time, in Britain in the 1960s, this was really very unusual. Academics and the real world were often two different planets. But Peter believed what Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel once said: we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor and never the victim. However, the truth is that in order to take sides, we need to be informed. We need to know what happened. We need to know why people before us took sides, what triggered them, what they feared, and how they overcame those fears. Because that, I believe, is one of the biggest problems. We create heroes, and we create them in such a way that young people are convinced they cannot be like that they are superhumans, a status impossible to achieve, and so they never embark on that path. This is so wrong, this is so detrimental. Heroes are human beings who at a certain moment decided they could no longer stand it, that they had to do something. My uncle Simon Luitse joined the Dutch resistance in the summer of 1940 after his beloved city of Rotterdam was bombed away by the Nazis. This made him so angry that he had to do something, and in the end, he paid for this with his life. On the contrary, my father managed to hide from the Germans during several years of occupation with a sign, "Cholera, contagious," on the door of his house. The Nazis were scared of anything contagious and didn't even try to find out who was living there. But when he met my mother, whose two brothers had been in the resistance, one did not return and the other one was pretty much traumatized, his reaction was to read endless books about the First and the Second World War, with a special interest in the camps and in the Holocaust, as a means, I think, to compensate. And by passing this on to me, he put me on the unavoidable track to oppose totalitarianism, and Peter Redaway did the rest. What I want to say is that in all of us are both a hero and a coward. It is the moment and the circumstances that determine what course we take. Wolfgang Thierse, the East German dissident and later chairman of the Bundestag, put it so nicely. There are real perpetrators and real victims, guilty ones and innocent ones, and then in between the many others, we who live there, busy getting by, more or less decent, more or less clever, more or less cowardly or brave. This is a reality we have to live with. But the factor that helps people to make choices is information, knowledge. And here the Sakharov Center can play an important role. We need to know about the mistakes of the past, the reason why they happened, and how some of these mistakes can be at least partially corrected by acknowledgement, by reconciliation. That is why on the program of this conference we talk about reconciliation programs in Canada and South Africa. We talk about the fact that the Dutch, who were seen as saviors of the Jews during the Second World War, were not much better than the Lithuanians, who are still seen as the Jew killers. This is why we want to talk about putting history in perspective of time, because there are moments that we have to acknowledge that we cannot judge our ancestors because we do not know the choices that they had to make. Above all, this is a conference to trigger discussion, to trigger thought. And that is what Leonidas Donskis stood for. He was a thinker, a philosopher, a public figure, but like Peter Redaway, he was an academic who was absolutely convinced that we academics have a role to play. We need to share our knowledge so that people can make real choices and hopefully choose for freedom and tolerance. It is tomorrow 8 years ago that Leonidas died. It was a horrible shock that still affects us today. But he's definitely not dead. What we are doing is very much in his spirit, and there are very few moments that we take decisions without considering what Leonidas thought or would have thought about that matter. May he rest in peace, and may we feel his inspiration for many years to come. And I think he would have enjoyed today's gathering, and undoubtedly he would have dominated it. Thank you. I hope you have a good conference.